The poem that outlived its poet, The Death of the Author. Kyla had spent longer among the dead poets of the House of Wisdom's archive than among the living scholars who argued over them, and that she had grown tired in her own quiet way of a particular question her students kept asking. The poem in front of them that week was a single ghazal, 7 couplets copied and recopied, so many times since the poet's death 2 generations earlier that no two surviving manuscripts agreed on every word. Its final couplet described a garden at dusk, a cup left unfilled, and a door the poet says he will not open again. It was by any measure a minor and obscure poem, until a vizier's secretary had recently declared in a public reading that it was in fact a coded lament for a disgraced minister. The garden, a figure for the court; the unfilled cup, a figure for a withheld pension. Rashid, Kalila's youngest copyist, had been sent to settle the matter. He had spent 3 weeks tracking down the poet's surviving letters, his students' notebooks, even the testimony of an elderly cousin who claimed to remember the poet's moods in his final year. He returned to Kalila with his findings arranged like evidence for a trial. The letters make no mention of any minister, he said, but they do mention twice a garden the poet tended himself outside Basra, and the habit of leaving a cup of wine out each evening for a guest who never came, his own brother who died young. I believe the poem is a private grief, not a political allegory at all. I can prove the vizier's secretary is simply wrong. Can you? Kalila said. It was not really a question. She had watched 3 separate readings of the same 7 couplets over the years. A Sufi scholar had once told her, with complete sincerity, that the closed door was the seeker's own heart, the unfilled cup a longing for union with the divine that no worldly wine could satisfy, and his reading held together as tightly and moved his listeners as genuinely as anything Rashid had assembled from the poet's letters. A court poet, decades before the vizier's secretary, had cited the same couplet as an example of romantic despair: the garden, a woman's memory; the door, a marriage that had ended. Each reading was coherent; each reader left the room changed by it. None of them had asked the poet's permission, and the poet, dead before any of these 3 readers had been born, had never adjudicated between them, could not adjudicate between them, and Kalila had come to suspect would not have been able to even if he lived to hear all 3. You found what the poet was thinking about the week he wrote it, she told Rashid. I don't doubt your letters, but do you imagine that once he set the poem down and let it leave his hand, his private grief still governed what it meant to every stranger who would ever read it, forever, in every century, in every language it would eventually be carried into? The Sufi reader owes the poet nothing, neither does the vizier's secretary. The poem left the poet's house the day he finished it. What it means now belongs to whoever is holding it. Rashid, young enough still to want a verdict, pressed her. Then there's no way to be wrong about a poem. Anyone can claim anything. No, Kalila said. A reading can still fail. It can contradict its own couplets, strain against the words on the page, collapse under its own weight. The Sufi reading holds together on its own terms. So does the political one. So probably does yours. What none of them can do any longer is appeal to the poet himself to settle which one wins. He is not available for questioning. He was never as available for questioning, even while he lived, as we like to imagine. The moment his pen left the page, the poem stopped needing him and started needing us. Delilah is articulating centuries before the term existed, the position the French critic Roland Barthes formalized in his 1967 essay The Death of the Author, La Mort de l'Auteur, the claim that a text's meaning cannot be authoritatively fixed by recovering the author's biography, stated intentions, psychological state, or historical circumstances at the time of composition, or Barthes treating the author's presumed intention as the final arbiter of meaning, what Anglo-American New Criticism had earlier termed Disapprovingly, the intentional fallacy, Wimsatt and Birdsley, 1946, mistakes one possible constraint on interpretation for the sole legitimate source of it. Barthes's essay was explicitly polemical, aimed at a criticism dominated by biographical reconstruction, reading a poem as a transparent window into its poet's life. Against this, he proposed that a text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture, rather than a message transmitted intact from a single controlling consciousness, and that meaning is produced at the site of reading, not the site of writing. His famous closing formulation that the birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author does not claim that authors do not exist or that all readings are equally valid. Rather, it relocates interpretive authority away from biographical recovery and toward the structures, ambiguities, and cultural resonances the text itself makes available to its readers. The essay sits alongside a closely related piece, Michel Foucault, What is an Author, 1969, which reframes the question institutionally. Rather than asking whether the author is dead, Foucault asks what work the concept of the author performs as a classificatory and disciplinary function, an author function that regulates how texts circulate, are attributed, and are permitted to mean, independent of any actual biographical person. Bach's distinction elsewhere between the readerly text, visible, which guides the reader toward a relatively fixed meaning, and the writerly text, scriptable, which invites the reader into active production of meaning, further develops this reader-centered model and anticipates Yulia Kristeva's concept of intertextuality, that every text is constituted from the traces of prior texts rather than springing from a single originating mind. The theory reshaped how graduate literary study approaches interpretation, not as a search for what an author really meant, recoverable through letters, drafts, or testimony, but as an account of how a text's own language, form, and cultural inheritance generate meaning in the encounter with each new reader. An encounter the author, however biographically fascinating, no longer has the authority to settle.